The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret. Elliot Grayson, a reclusive lighthouse keeper in his mid-50s, had spent decades tending to the remote lighthouse perched on the rugged coast of Maine. The lighthouse, standing tall and solitary against the relentless sea, was shrouded in perpetual fog, its beacon cutting through the mist like a lone eye in the darkness. Isolated from the world, Elliot lived alone, his only company the howling winds and the crashing waves that ceaselessly battered the cliffs below. But the solitude was not his choice. Years ago, his wife, Nora, had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the sea or something far worse. Her disappearance had left a wound in Elliot's heart that never healed, a void filled only by his monotonous routine. Each day, he climbed the spiraling stairs to tend to the light, his movements mechanical, his thoughts drifting to memories of Nora. Yet lately, those memories were no longer his only companions. Strange occurrences had begun to disturb the stillness of his lonely life. At night, Elliot would hear odd noises rising from the depths, a low, rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the lighthouse. The tides, once predictable, had become erratic, with waves crashing against the lighthouse with unnatural force, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. The air itself felt heavier, thick with an unspoken dread that gnawed at his mind. The locals, when they ventured close enough to speak with him, would whisper about the lighthouse, their eyes flickering with fear. They spoke of old legends, of a dark history tied to the lighthouse, tales of disappearances and strange happenings that Elliot had always dismissed as superstitions. But now, with Nora's absence lingering like a ghost in his thoughts, he found it harder to ignore the signs. A growing sense of unease took root within him, a fear that perhaps the legends were true, and that the lighthouse harbored secrets far darker than he had ever imagined. One stormy night, as the winds howled and the waves crashed violently against the cliffs, Elliot stood at the top of the lighthouse, peering out into the darkness. The storm was ferocious, the kind that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the earth. The sea, whipped into a frenzy, roared like a beast, sending massive waves crashing against the rocky shore. But as Elliot stared into the churning water, something unusual caught his eye: massive, writhing shapes just beneath the surface, moving with an unsettling purpose. At first, he thought it might be debris tossed about by the storm, but as he watched, the shapes became clearer, more defined. His heart pounded as he realized what he was seeing. Colossal tentacles, dark and sinuous, slowly rising from the depths. They emerged from the water with terrifying strength, glistening with seawater, and began to wrap around the base of the lighthouse. The structure groaned under the pressure, the ancient stone walls trembling as the tentacles tightened their grip, as if the sea itself was trying to drag the lighthouse into its depths. Panic surged through Elliot as the full weight of the situation hit him. Something deep and ancient was awakening, something that had been slumbering beneath the waves for centuries. Desperate for answers, he descended into the bowels of the lighthouse, where the damp, stone walls seemed to close in around him. In a forgotten corner, buried under dust and cobwebs, he discovered an old, weathered journal, its pages brittle with age. It belonged to the previous lighthouse keeper, a man whose name had long been erased by time. As Elliot flipped through the pages, his blood ran cold. The journal told a tale of horror, of a creature that dwelled in the depths, demanding sacrifices to appease its insatiable hunger. The final, chilling entry revealed the truth that Elliot had feared. Nora had been taken by the creature years ago, a sacrifice to keep it at bay. And now, the creature had returned, its hunger renewed, demanding another offering. The revelation struck him like a blow, the realization that the sea had come for him, and there was no escape from this ancient terror that lurked beneath the waves. As the monstrous tentacles tightened their grip around the lighthouse, the ancient stone walls groaned under the immense pressure. The entire structure shuddered, the once sturdy beacon now teetering on the brink of destruction. Elliot, armed with nothing but his resolve, knew he had to confront the horror that had risen from the depths. His heart raced as he scrambled to find something, anything, to defend himself. But all he had was his fading courage and the cold, biting wind that whipped through the open door. The creature's deep, rumbling growls reverberated through the lighthouse, the sound like the grinding of ancient, unseen gears deep within the earth. The noise was deafening, shaking the very foundations of the tower and echoing through Elliot's bones. Despite his fear, he refused to be paralyzed, clinging to the hope that he could somehow appease the creature to save himself from the same fate that had claimed Nora. But as he prepared to face the monstrous entity, a sound cut through the storm, freezing him in place. A voice, soft and haunting, called his name, Nora's voice. It floated up from the depths below, carried on the wind like a ghostly whisper. Elliot's heart twisted with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Was it really her after all these years? The thought tugged at him, pulling him toward the edge of the sea, where the massive form of the creature loomed, its dark, writhing mass barely visible in the stormy darkness. As he peered into the abyss, the swirling waters parted just enough for him to see her. Nora, or what was left of her, emerged from the depths. Her once warm and familiar features were now twisted into something inhuman, her eyes glowing with a deep, unnatural hunger. Her skin, pale and translucent, shimmered with an eerie light, and her movements were no longer her own, but dictated by the ancient, malevolent force that controlled her. She had become a servant of the creature, bound to it for eternity. The sight of Nora, so grotesquely transformed, shattered the last remnants of Elliot's resolve. Torn between the fear of what she had become and the hope that he could somehow reach her, he found himself unable to move, rooted to the spot as the full horror of the situation bore down on him. The creature's growls grew louder, more insistent, as if urging him to join Nora in the depths. Elliot, trembling with both fear and desperation, reached out toward Nora, hoping against hope that he could somehow save her from the monstrous fate that had claimed her. But as his fingers brushed against her cold, pallid skin, the sea creature seized its moment. Massive, slick tentacles surged forward with terrifying speed, wrapping around Elliot's body and dragging him toward the cold, dark depths of the ocean. He struggled against the crushing grip, but it was futile. His strength no match for the ancient, malevolent force that pulled him relentlessly downward. As the icy water closed over his head, Elliot felt the crushing weight of the ocean pressing in on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. Panic surged through him, but it was quickly replaced by a dawning horror as he realized the true nature of his fate. He was not merely being pulled under to drown. No, he was to be transformed, just as Nora had been, into a servant of the ancient being that lurked in the abyss. The creature's power seeped into him, its presence overwhelming and inescapable. His body began to change, the icy water twisting his flesh, reshaping him into something unrecognizable. As he was dragged deeper, the last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Nora's face. Her eyes no longer filled with the warmth he remembered, but with a cold, inhuman gaze. Yet within that gaze, he saw a flicker of sorrow, mingled with acceptance, as if she understood all too well the fate that now awaited him. The storm above subsided, the waves calming as the lighthouse stood silent once more. The beacon, its light steady but dimmer than before, continued to sweep across the water, unaware of the horror that had unfolded beneath it. The sea, now eerily still, harbored a new secret. A lighthouse keeper who had joined the dark ranks of the ancient guardians of the deep, forever bound to the cold, unforgiving depths of the ocean. The forbidden ritual. Adrian Dumitrescu, a young and ambitious anthropologist, arrived in the small, isolated village of Valea Serpulor with his assistant, Irina Popescu, at his side. The village was a place forgotten by time, its crumbling buildings leaning precariously under the weight of centuries. Narrow cobblestone streets wound through the mist-shrouded town, where the fog clung to everything, muting the colors and sounds of the world. The villagers, clad in dark, weathered clothes, watched the newcomers with suspicious eyes, their gazes filled with unspoken warnings. Whispers followed Adrian and Irina wherever they went, but no one dared approach them directly. Adrian's interest had been piqued by tales of an ancient cult that had once flourished in this remote corner of Romania. A cult that worshipped a tentacle deity said to dwell in the shadows of forgotten places. It was the perfect subject for his research, a chance to uncover the truth behind the legends that had long been dismissed as mere folklore. Irina, knowledgeable in ancient rituals and equally intrigued by the stories, eagerly joined him on this expedition. As they settled into the village, the locals grew more restless. Several villagers, their faces etched with fear, warned Adrian and Irina to stay away from the old church that sat at the edge of the village, its spire barely visible through the thick fog. The church had been abandoned for generations, they said, after something terrible had happened there, something that should never be disturbed. But these warnings only fueled Adrian's curiosity. The more they heard about the church, the more they felt drawn to it, as if the ancient secrets buried within its walls were calling to them. Ignoring the villagers' pleas, Adrian and Irina began to prepare for their visit to the church, eager to uncover the truth behind the sinister legends that had kept it hidden from the world for so long. The air was thick with anticipation, and a sense of foreboding settled over the village, as if the land itself knew that something dark was about to be awakened. Ignoring the dire warnings, Adrian and Irina made their way to the abandoned church that loomed at the edge of the village. The structure, once grand and imposing, now stood in a state of ruin. The walls were crumbling, the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the stained glass windows were shattered, their once vibrant colors now reduced to dull shards scattered across the stone floor. As they stepped inside, a thick, musty odor filled the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Yet despite the decay, an eerie atmosphere of reverence still clung to the space, as if the rituals performed here had left a lingering echo of their dark power. Adrian led the way through the nave, his footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. The pews were broken, splintered and scattered across the floor, but Adrian's focus was on something deeper, an unspoken promise of discovery. Irina followed closely, her eyes scanning the walls for any signs of the ancient cult they sought to uncover. As they ventured further into the church, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over them, as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. At the far end of the church, hidden behind a heavy wooden door that creaked ominously on its hinges, they found what they were looking for: an ancient ritual site. A large stone altar dominated the space, its surface covered in strange, carved symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Surrounding the altar were decaying relics of the past, ceremonial objects, bones, and tattered robes, all arranged in a pattern that suggested a purpose long forgotten. Irina, her breath catching in her throat, began to study the symbols on the altar. Her extensive knowledge of ancient rituals guided her as she carefully translated the markings. But as she spoke the ancient words aloud, the atmosphere in the church shifted. The air became thick and oppressive, pressing down on them with an almost tangible weight. The ground beneath them trembled, sending ripples through the stone floor. It was then that Irina realized, with a growing sense of dread, what they had done. In their eagerness to uncover the truth, they had unwittingly activated the first steps of a forbidden ritual. The walls of the church seemed to come alive, warping and twisting as nightmarish tentacles began to emerge, writhing and coiling toward them. The boundary between reality and something far more sinister had begun to blur, pulling them into an alternate, eldritch reality where the deity they had awakened awaited them with an insatiable hunger. The church quickly transformed into a nightmarish trap as the tentacles multiplied, their grotesque forms writhing through the air, tearing through the ancient stone walls as if they were nothing more than paper. The once silent and decayed sanctuary became alive with movement, the tentacles twisting and coiling with an unnatural fluidity. Adrian and Irina, now fully aware of the danger they had unleashed, tried to flee, but the church itself seemed to rebel against them. The walls warped and shifted, turning the familiar structure into an impossible, ever-changing maze. Corridors that once led to the exit now looped back on themselves, while doors opened into spaces that defied all logic, leading only to further chaos. Panic surged through Adrian as he realized they were trapped. The air was thick with a suffocating dread, the very presence of the deity pressing down on them like a dark, malevolent force. It was not just the physical manifestation of the tentacles that threatened them, but the overwhelming sense of doom that filled the space. The deity's will was palpable, a consciousness that filled every corner of the church, pulling them closer to an unfathomable darkness. Irina, more attuned to the rituals they had accidentally invoked, was the first to understand the full scope of their predicament. Her voice, strained and trembling, cut through the chaos. "Adrian, we're not in our world anymore," she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "We've crossed into the deity's reality, its domain." The realization hit them both like a cold wave. This was no longer a mere building of stone and mortar, but a living, breathing extension of the ancient deity they had awakened. Desperate to undo the damage, Irina began chanting counter-incantations, drawing on every scrap of knowledge she had. Her voice rose above the chaos, the ancient words filled with urgency and fear. But the deity was not to be so easily appeased. The tentacles, enraged by her efforts, lashed out with renewed fury. Their movements became more aggressive, their forms more solid and terrifying, as if fueled by the very incantations meant to banish them. One of the tentacles, thicker and more menacing than the others, struck out with lightning speed, wrapping around Irina's waist and pulling her toward the center of the church. There, a dark void had opened, a swirling, endless abyss that radiated a terrifying, magnetic pull. Irina struggled against the crushing grip, her voice faltering as she was dragged closer to the void. The ancient words turned to screams as the void's pull intensified, the darkness beckoning her with the promise of oblivion. Adrian watched in horror, paralyzed by fear and helplessness, as Irina was dragged toward the dark void. The reality around them continued to twist and bend, the deity's presence now fully awakened and enraged. The church, once a sanctuary, had become a gateway to something far worse, and Irina was about to be claimed by it. As Irina was pulled into the void, her desperate screams echoed through the church, filling the air with a chilling finality. Adrian reached out, but the distance between them was too great, and the tentacles were too strong. He watched in helpless horror as the tentacles closed around her completely, dragging her into the swirling darkness. Her screams were abruptly cut off, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. The void, now sated, began to recede, but the malevolent presence in the church only seemed to grow stronger. Desperate and driven by sheer terror, Adrian knew he had to escape before the same fate befell him. He fought his way through the collapsing, warping structure, narrowly avoiding the grasping tentacles that lashed out from every direction. The church seemed to twist and crumble around him, the walls bending and the floor buckling as if the building itself was being pulled into the void. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, every step a battle against the chaotic forces that threatened to consume him. Finally, he burst out of the church, collapsing onto the cold ground outside as the structure behind him seemed to implode, the dark presence drawing it into nothingness. But as he gasped for breath, the nightmare was far from over. A searing pain burned on his chest, and when he pulled back his shirt, he saw it. A dark symbol, ancient and malevolent, burned into his skin. Horrified, Adrian stumbled to a nearby stream, desperate to see his reflection. What he saw chilled him to the bone. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were darkening, a shadow creeping into his gaze. The realization hit him like a blow. He had been marked by the deity, cursed by the ritual they had unleashed. He was doomed to slowly transform into a creature like the one he had unwittingly awakened, forever bound to the cursed power of the forbidden ritual. The escape had only been temporary. His fate was sealed. The deep below, the deep-sea research facility, anchored in the crushing depths of the Mariana Trench, was a marvel of engineering. Here, Dr. Claire Marshall led a team of scientists on a mission to explore the ocean's darkest, most uncharted regions. The facility, isolated from the world above, was surrounded by the oppressive blackness of the abyss, with only the cold hum of machinery and the distant calls of unknown creatures breaking the silence. Captain Liam O'Connor, head of security, kept a vigilant eye on the crew's safety. During a routine expedition, Claire and her team made a shocking discovery. A massive, ancient creature lurking in the trench, its countless tentacles stretching into the darkness. The creature seemed to be watching them, its presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Despite their initial shock, the team was eager to study this unprecedented find, unaware of the danger that loomed ahead. As the research continued, the creature's behavior took a terrifying turn. It began lashing out at the facility's remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, its massive tentacles smashing them with alarming precision. The attacks soon escalated, with the creature causing structural damage to the facility itself. Metal groaned under the pressure as unseen forces battered the habitat, and the once secure environment began to feel dangerously fragile. Dr. Claire Marshall's initial excitement turned to deep concern for the safety of her crew. Captain Liam O'Connor, sensing the growing threat, ordered the facility to go on high alert. But the creature's aggression only intensified. Its tentacles struck with purpose, as if it knew exactly where to hit, targeting key systems within the facility. The crew's unease grew into outright fear as they realized this was no mindless beast. They were dealing with something far more sinister, a creature with a dark intelligence, intent on infiltrating their last sanctuary. As the situation deteriorated, the creature's true intentions became horrifyingly clear. Its tentacles breached the facility, slipping through the smallest cracks and crevices, invading every corner of their supposed sanctuary. Crew members began to disappear, dragged into the dark depths by the relentless tendrils. When they reappeared, they were no longer themselves. Grotesque hybrids, part human, part sea monster, with dead, glassy eyes and movements controlled by the creature's sinister will. Dr. Claire Marshall and Captain Liam O'Connor soon realized that the creature was using these twisted abominations to weaken the facility from within. The research habitat, once a refuge, transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. The mutated crew members, driven by the creature's malevolent intelligence, hunted down the remaining survivors with terrifying efficiency. Claire and Liam fought desperately to protect what was left of their team, but the creature's influence was everywhere, corrupting everything it touched. Time and options were running out, and they knew they were up against a force far beyond their understanding. With the facility on the brink of collapse, Claire and Liam made a desperate bid for survival. They raced through the crumbling structure, dodging the creature's relentless tentacles that tore through metal and glass with terrifying ease. Their only hope lay in the facility's last operational submersible. They managed to reach it and launch, the small vessel plunging into the dark waters. But their relief was short-lived. As they began their ascent, the creature's massive tentacles broke through the sub's hull, dragging it back into the abyss. The last thing Claire saw before darkness consumed them was the creature's glowing eyes, filled with malevolent intelligence. The sub was pulled deeper into the trench, where the creature would prepare them to join its horrific brood, leaving nothing but the silent, endless dark of the deep below.